key legislative deadlines fast approaching, Governor Scott's administration unveils their education reform proposal.
Vermont's governance structure is complex, with 52 supervisory unions, under which there are 119 districts. We can't just make small tweaks, we must redesign our system.
Plus, a look inside Senator Bernie Sanders' Fighting Oligarchy tour. And why some Canadians are skipping Vermont for the next 4 years. All of that and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel.
Thanks for joining us on Vermont This Week. I'm Mikaela Lefrak in for Mitch Wertlieb. It is Friday, February 28th. Joining us on the panel this week is Kevin McCallum from 7 Days, Ethan Weinstein from VTDigger, and Brittany Patterson from Vermont Public. Thank you all for being here. Town meeting day is next week, and many of you probably remember last year's town meeting day when nearly a third of school budgets failed. People all around the state were concerned about their rising property taxes. Now, legislators and the governor made some short-term changes to the education funding system, but they've also vowed to come up with a longer-term fix. This week, Governor Phil Scott introduced his education transformation bill to the legislature. Ethan, you were tasked with reviewing all 176 pages of it. What stood out to you?
Well, Mikaela, this has been the most anticipated piece of legislation this year. And although the governor and his team have been releasing bits and pieces of it throughout the session, we got our first look this week. In broad strokes, the governor wants to consolidate Vermont school districts from more than 100 down to 5, and he wants to transition the state to what's called a foundation formula. This would be a new way to pay for education. A lot of what we saw in the 176 pages were things that we could have predicted, but a few of the surprises or key details that I highlighted were class size minimums. He's looking at bringing the size of 4th to 12th grade classes to 25 students at a minimum. That's a big change for a lot of Vermont's small schools. He's also proposing very strict restrictions on private schools eligible to receive public dollars. This is a contentious issue for Democrats and Republicans alike. And I think those were a couple of the details that really got people's attention.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about the restrictions on private schools that are eligible for public dollars? Because as you said, this has been something that, when we talk about it on Vermont Edition, people feel a lot of feelings about this one.
Yeah, it's a bit wonky. So, something like 95 or 90% of Vermont students attend public school. But there's this smaller percentage who can use public dollars to attend private school if their school district doesn't operate a public school. What Governor Scott is proposing is that only private schools that currently enroll more than 51% publicly tuitioned students would be eligible to continue receiving public dollars. And in practice, this means that only something like 6 or 7 schools would be able to receive public funds, and right now, it's dozens and dozens.
So Governor Scott has introduced this bill to the legislature, which is still Democrat-controlled. I want to talk about some of the responses that we've been hearing from Democratic leadership, because there has been some pushback, specifically around the foundation formula, as it's called. Here's Representative Charles Kimball, who's a Democrat from Woodstock.
We will look at adopting a foundation formula, but we don't think the current way it's constructed is right. So we're not going to rush into just adopting a foundation formula for the sake of doing it. We want to make sure the numbers are right. We don't think we can get all that done in this legislative session.
Seems like there's a bit of a time crunch, Democrats are saying.
Yeah, I think as that clip suggests, there's consensus that the state is probably moving in this direction. The question is, the AOE, the Agency of Education, they've brought forward their idea for a foundation formula, and I think that Democratic leadership, they want to have the opportunity to work with their own consultants, their own experts, develop a plan in tandem, and maybe find a middle ground rather than relying entirely on these very complicated equations and modeling performed by the administration.
And Ethan, one last thing, as we mentioned, town meeting day is next week. Is education going to be your focus as you're talking to voters next week? It'll be my focus. I know I'm hearing a lot of different predictions in terms of whether we'll see something like last year. I think, I'm not in the prediction business, but people are suggesting they expect fewer school budgets will fail than last year. Yeah. Well, education funding has dominated the conversation in Montpelier over these last couple of months, but it is far from the only issue that lawmakers have been discussing there. Brittany, you've been following some proposed changes to hunting regulations in the state. What's going on?
Yeah, so these regulations are coming from the Fish and Wildlife Department in Vermont. They were made by the 14-member Wildlife Board, but the agency's biologists support them. And really, there's a couple different regulations on the table. Turkey, some moose changes, a little bit of changes to how meat is transported from out of state into state. I think the most substantial changes are around the deer hunting regulations. So tell us a little bit more. Are they trying to, it sounds like they're trying to cull more deer with the same amount of hunters in Vermont. How do you do that? That's exactly right. So for the first time in perhaps decades, Vermont is proposing to open up the regular fall season, and that's when we have the most hunters hunting. Currently, hunters are only hunting bucks during that season, but the agency wants to open it up so that they can hunt does with rifles and shotguns. And the idea really is that when you're talking to biologists, there are too many female deers, sometimes called antlerless deers, in certain parts of the state, and not enough hunters to be able to take care of them, to reduce those populations. And so the Fish and Wildlife Department thinks that by opening up regular season this way, some 20 to 25,000 additional hunters who only hunt during the regular season will now have the opportunity, if they want to shoot a doe. And that could have potentially a big impact. Okay, so potentially my garden will not be consumed as terribly as it was. Are there other negative impacts of having too many deer in the state other than, eating all of my rainbow chard? Yeah, absolutely. So it's not just your garden that is, oftentimes decimated by our deer friends. Where there is an overabundance of deer, we see often certain species in the forest, in that forest understory especially, that are overeaten. And then that decreases the overall health of the forest. And then that makes it hard for all of the species that are in that environment to be able to thrive. And so, biologists say the state needs more levers to be able to control this deer population, and hunting is a big one of those. These rules would also, if passed, they would open up archery season during the regular season, and in some cases allow some hunters to take a second buck. In other news from Montpelier, Governor Phil Scott wants the legislature to exempt military pensions from state income taxes. Ethan and Kevin, I know you guys have both reported on this a bit. Kevin, let's get you in here first. Sure. Why is this an issue that the governor is pushing?
Well, he's long felt that if Vermont did away with taxation of military pensions, that it would cause military veterans to decide to move here, basically. That as military veterans look toward the end of their career, where are they going to go next? That they look at the tax structure and say, here's our options. And Vermont is one of only 3 states, I think, in the nation that taxes military pensions. And so he's long thought that if you got rid of that, we would get a a flood, but certainly a decent number of military veterans moving to the state, and he has a very high regard for military veterans in terms of their skills and their leadership abilities and their work ethic. And so we've heard for years that he wanted to do away with this, but Democrats have always kind of viewed it as a tax break, right? Why are we going to give tax breaks to one individual group of people? But it seems as though this idea is gaining a little more traction this year, in part because he's pushing the labor angle. It's like, these are not retirees who are done working. These are often people who've got a 20-year career in the military, are now in their 40s and 50s and in the prime of their working lives. And the idea is, if you can get a military veteran to move here at the age of 45 with 2 kids, buy a house and join the workforce, that would be a perfect opportunity to boost Vermont's workforce.
So it's a workforce issue too, Ethan, is what you're hearing?
Yeah, I mean, as Kevin mentions, a lot of these folks retire at an age when they still really want to work. The governor, as part of his budget this year, presented, I think, $13.5 million in tax breaks, and a bunch of them have been popular ideas for Democrats. Expanding the child tax credit, expanding the earned income tax credit. These are things that Democratic leadership have seemingly bought into, and maybe this is the year we finally see some movement on this military pension exemption.
Well, Brittany, you recently attended the Northeast Kingdom Lobbying Day at the State House in Montpelier. I'm curious if there were any particular concerns from folks who live in that part of our region that they were bringing to lawmakers, or any of the issues that we've discussed today, or those on people's minds?
Yeah, there was a really good showing of folks from all across the kingdom for NEK Day. And I think by and large, the thing that emerged as the most important and the one they really wanted to stress to lawmakers is concerning is the idea of losing access to rural health care. So folks are probably familiar with this fall, the Oliver Wyman report that came out that was commissioned by the state and calls for really big changes to the way Vermont's healthcare system works in order to make it sustainable. And a lot of those changes are at rural hospitals, potential closures, potential cuts, and both the CEO of the hospital in St. Johnsbury and the CEO of North Country Hospital in Newport were at NEK Day and had been lobbying lawmakers all that week and beyond, really trying to push the message home that if we lose these hospitals or if we hollow them out to the point where, it's basically not something where you can get emergency care, for example, you're going to lose. That's going to be the end for these communities. They're already seeing challenges hiring for the hospital, but also in convincing people to come to the region. Because if you can't get good health care and you need to drive an hour and it's emergency, that's a challenging thing to have to balance.
Yeah. And I know that you've also been keeping a close eye on the incoming tariffs from the Trump administration on Canada, and I can imagine those would have a bit of a unique impact on the Northeast Kingdom, maybe on tourism as well, being so close to the border.
Yeah, absolutely. I've spent the last week actually reporting out some Canadians are canceling visits this summer, especially up in the Northeast Kingdom. I talked to someone who owns lodging off of Kingdom Trails, talked to the CEO of J Peak, and, up in the kingdom and in parts even of northern Vermont, we're talking about 30% or more of the business being generated by the Canadian market. And so I think it could be a big chunk of change for especially folks in communities that are on the border to see some of these Canadians, make the hard decision to take a step back and to not frequent Vermont right now. Because of the rhetoric that's coming out of the Trump administration, which includes these tariffs, which, as of right now, are slated to go into effect next Tuesday.
Kevin, you have spent a lot of time over the last couple of days reporting on some of the unique overlaps between the Trump administration's policies and our local leaders' response to those. But you weren't in Vermont.
No.
You went to the Midwest.
I sure did.
What were you doing out there?
I was following Bernie Sanders around the Midwest as he went on his Fighting Oligarchy tour. He has gotten back in the saddle, basically, and decided that the only effective way for the the left to push back on some of the policies out of the White House is to put pressure on Republican lawmakers to do the right thing and to stand up to Trump. And so what he and his people decided to do was to head to the Midwest, to Omaha, and also to Iowa City, to hold really big rallies and to try to urge people to call their Congress people and say, do not vote for the budget reconciliation bill, which was up for a key vote the other day. And so
I feel like we should get this out of the way first.
Yeah.
Did it work?
It didn't work.
Yeah.
It didn't work. No, only one Republican, I think, stood up and opposed that bill, and he only needed 2. So it was a very close and very dramatic vote, and frankly, my story was ready to run, and we had to rewrite the thing because the vote was happening at like 8 o'clock at night on Tuesday. And so it was very close. It was, people, it was surprising to see Bernie Sanders still able to generate huge enthusiasm and huge crowds in the Midwest when he wasn't running for anything, right? He's going there on an issue. And so he didn't, and he was surprised. His team originally planned to hold a rally in a small to moderate sized union hall in the suburbs of Omaha. And then they had this RSVP, thing on their website about who wants to come to this, and it just went through the roof. And so they had to cancel their venue, move to downtown Omaha into a Marriott to be able to accommodate what turned out to be 3,400 people who showed up, many of them just extremely excited and gratified to see Vermont's senior senator urging them on, urging them to fight, urging them to push back, because there's a lot of, and the people I spoke with, many of them have felt quite hopeless in the last couple months since Trump's reelection, and they don't know what to do. It's like, what am I supposed to do? I'm seeing this chaos out of DC. I don't agree with any of the things that he's doing. What am I, as a voter, as an individual, supposed to do? Well, Bernie was giving them a path, right? Bernie was saying, here's what you do. You make some calls, you send some emails, you push back, you fight. And that message really resonated with a lot of people. So it was a fun trip. It was exhausting. It was short, but it was an impressive showing for Vermont's senator.
And you and the senator caught the same flight back,
yeah,
I hear.
We did end up being on the same flight out of Chicago back to Burlington. And that was interesting to see too, because he, if there was ever any question about his sort of rock star status, the guy walks through an airport and people are like, can I get a selfie with you, Senator? I appreciate you, Senator. There's all this sort of, he's a national public figure. Yeah. And so it follows him everywhere he goes.
Well, he is not the only member of Vermont's congressional delegation who has been pushing back against some of the Trump administration's policies. The 3-person delegation held a virtual town hall this past week, and it reported massive attendance numbers. 34,000 people tuned in virtually. Let's take a look at what that was like.
We have Vermont farmers who, with the commitment of the federal government, signed a contract where if they borrowed money to do environmentally sensitive things that are going to help their farm and help our climate, they would get paid back by the federal government. They got emails saying, no, that's on hold, you're on your own. And we hear from farmers who don't know how they're going to pay the bills. The concern that I'm hearing from Vermonters who are calling and writing and who I'm seeing on the street, that we have a constitutional crisis in the making. You're right.
I know there are quite a few people in Vermont who supported Donald Trump in the last election. And I know I speak for my colleagues here. It does not matter to us who you voted for. What matters to us is how Vermonters are going to survive this moment. I need you to know that we represent so many of our colleagues who see this as we do, a critical moment when the democracy is on the line, and they are going to have to get through us to tear this down.
They're going to have to get through us to tear this down. Kevin, thoughts on that message?
Yeah, it's tough talk, and it's lofty rhetoric, and it's impressive that the three of them, I think, got together and presented a united front that, and it was the message I think Vermonters needed to hear. But ultimately, right, the vote, as I already said, the vote the other day didn't didn't pan out. And so I think there's this open question about, what Becca's saying there is they're going to have to come through us to tear down the government, and it looks as though they have the votes to be able to do that. And so I'm not entirely sure how much resistance, right, the Democrats and independents from Vermont or elsewhere in the Congress are really going to be able to present to some of the things that the Republicans are up to.
Well, we've talked about some state-level resistance, some on-the-ground resistance, including from Canadians who are choosing not to spend their dollars in the United States over the next 4 years. One person who isn't skipping Vermont, though, is Vice President J.D. Vance. He and his family are coming to Sugar Bush to ski this weekend. Local officials and businesses are preparing for the family to arrive, as well as dozens of Secret Service agents and protesters. Now, Governor Phil Scott issued a statement today welcoming the vice president and his family and noting the good ski weather that we've had this winter. He also reminded Vermonters to be respectful, even if they disagree with the vice president and the Trump administration's policies, since the vice president is traveling with his young children. All right, there are so many different ways that the Trump administration's policies have been affecting Vermonters on the state level. One thing that's interesting, Ethan, I'm hoping you can help us understand this change that could come. Lawmakers are thinking about taking away authority or taking authority over partnerships with federal immigration authorities. Why are they thinking about doing that?
Yeah, it's a little bit wonky, but as the law is written now, were President Trump to declare a state of emergency at Vermont's northern border with Canada, it would basically open up the opportunity for law enforcement, town police departments or sheriff's departments, to enter into agreements with ICE or Border Patrol. We've heard calls from President Trump, obviously, for mass deportations and mass incarceration, rounding people up. The way the law is written now, only Governor Scott would have authority to enter into these partnerships. But we've seen that President Trump is willing to declare states of emergencies for things that many might not consider emergencies. And so Democratic lawmakers are concerned that this could be a problem for us.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that that the Democrats initially pushed to have a say in whether the governor struck these deals and allowed agreements to go forward with ICE, because for that exact reason, right? They don't want the governor to be the sole authority in the state of Vermont for whether ICE is able to come and conduct sweeps in the state with the assistance of state law enforcement. So they're like, hey, why don't you come to us and ask us if we're okay with that, and we can have a combined jurisdiction over that. We can have a shared power over whether ICE collaboration occurs in the state. And very quickly, the governor's people shot that down. They said, look, I'm the executive. I'm the governor of the state. I have the power to do this, and it makes no sense to allow the legislature to come in and also have a say in that. And so I just think he felt it was an overreach. And so it went away pretty quickly. I don't think that piece is in the bill anymore. There is some desire to sort of put some guardrails around what immigration officials can do in the state that are not quite worked out yet, but that big picture idea of lawmakers having a say in ICE raids and ICE immigration work in the state is dead.
Brittany, you, again, were reporting on the NEK lobbying day. You're also planning to go up to the J area on town meeting day. Has this issue of immigration and border security come up in any of your conversations with folks who live in that region?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we have been hearing trickles of people starting to ask, like, are we headed toward like a war with Canada? What will that mean for these communities on the border? I think it's probably far too early to go that direction. But I think there is a lot of concern, especially in communities where, the back and forth over the border is something that happens all the time. And concerns over like what that relationship is going to look like moving forward.
You also reported, Brittany, on a University of New Hampshire poll. They polled Vermonters on their approval ratings for President Donald Trump. What did that study find?
I think you won't be surprised to hear it didn't find anything super surprising, that things really break down on the partisan level. So, 1/3 of Vermonters approve of Donald Trump's performance so far, whereas 2/3 do not. And it was really like Republicans giving the support to Trump and Democrats really not. So if we break it down for that 1/3, I think it was 86% of Republicans thought Trump was doing a good job, when only 1% of Democrats did and 18% of independents. So it's very much partisan. The University of New Hampshire Survey Center, and they do this quite often, they also looked at executive orders, and no surprise, still a breakdown partisanly. Democrats really disagreeing with a lot of Trump's executive orders early on in his tenure, Republicans supporting them.
Well, there is going to be lots of change ahead when it comes to the Trump administration's policies and their effect on this region. I'm so glad that all three of you are covering it in your own ways. Let's end on some Mikaela-related news. The greatest ski racer of all time, at least I'm going to say that because she's a fellow Mikaela. Mikaela Shiffrin has become the first person ever to win 100 World Cup alpine ski races in the 58-year history of the competition. She went to Burke Mountain Academy, so we like to claim her as our own. And after overcoming a puncture wound in Killington back in November, she went on to secure this historic win in Italy this past weekend. So congratulations to Mikaela Shiffrin. And a reminder yet again that town meeting day is this coming Tuesday, March 4th. We hope you all have productive meetings and votes and maybe a free slice of pie as well. Next week, we are going to recap town meeting day results. We'll also provide some through lines and analysis for you all as well. Until then, I'm Mikaela Lefrak, and thank you so much for tuning in. That's where we're going to have to leave it for today. Our panel is Kevin McCallum from 7 Days, Ethan Weinstein from VTDigger, and Brittany Patterson from Vermont Public. Thank you all for watching and listening.